And I've got some good folks on here that's going to help me with this that's been around for a long time. What we're talking about this morning is emotional sobriety. And, at the end of the day, that's what sobriety is. You cannot use a substance, and that's great. That gets you to the starting gate, that we must, in order to get emotional sobriety, we have got to have physical sobriety. And one of the things that people do, and I've seen it over and over and over, and I've seen it in myself, is that in years ago, I don't think we even knew to really delve into the emotional sobriety. Well, we did, because it's through the steps that we learn how to live clean and sober. And sobriety, my definition of sobriety is being free of all mind altering chemicals. You can be free of alcohol by the grace of God, or drugs, and be eating yourself to death or starving yourself to death through anorexia, or you can be using any kind of process addiction, which is netting, spending, work addiction. So what I'm talking about, we can switch addictions. And I see that, and I've seen it in myself in early recovery. So we're in good company when we talk about emotional sobriety, because Bill W. suffered, Bill W. suffered from massive, and I talked about Abraham Lincoln last week about suffering from depression. Bill W. suffered from massive amounts of depression, and 16 years sober. Bill had one of those flash of light spiritual experiences, like Paul did on Damascus Road, where instantly he was changed, and Bill instantly had that the desire to drink removed from him. Very few people have that. Most people have what Dr. Bob had, which was the educational type of slow awakening, where we just peel off the layers. And it was 2 years before Dr. Bob. Those first 2 years, he wanted to drink just about every day. And how Bob kept from drinking is he worked with others. That he, would work in his office, and then he'd go out and find a drunk to work with and bring him home and sober him up in their home. So, but Bill wasn't like that. Bill had that flash of light, spiritual experience. God removed that desire to drink from his brain instantly. And but what he didn't remove from his brain was depression. And 16 years sober, Bill didn't want to drink, but he wanted to kill himself. He hated his life, or he hated how he was living his life, and that he and he wrote a letter, and I'm going to read the whole letter. But if you haven't ever read it, I would suggest you get a copy and read it, because it's really, Bill was always a step ahead in his time. What Bill was talking about in this letter to depression, he was talking about codependency. He was really talking, and we didn't even have the word then. But what Bill was talking about is that in his 16 years of sobriety, what he had to learn is to how to grow up emotionally and spiritually. And, it was painful. And, when he was the leader of the, AA community and was helping AA grow and all, and here he found himself immature and childlike in so many ways. And what he realized was that his dependency, he had so much dependency on his wife Lois, and he had so much dependency on his AA groups, his people in AA. That's where he got his good feelings about himself, is working with others, and that's not a bad thing. But the thing about it is, in his letter, he writes about not being emotionally sober. He could get drunk on his emotions. Any of y'all identify with that? Get drunk on his emotions. He would get, irritable, restless, and discontented. And so, what he says in the letter, and like I said, I'm not going to read all of the letter, but it was 16 years sober is actually what came out of this. Something good can come out of anything, and what came out of this time in Bill's life was the 12 and 12. He knew that he had to dig down deeper, and so that's when God really showed him the 12 and the information, the 12 and 12. So he kept asking himself, why can't the 12 steps work to release depression? And what came to him was the St. Francis prayer. It's better to understand than to be understood. Addicts of any sort, we just want people to understand us. Well, if they just understood, if they could just understand my bad moods, bless my heart, Addicts want to be understood. But Bill tells us sobriety is more about understanding than, it comes right out of St. Francis' prayer. It's better to understand than to be understood. It's better to love than to be loved. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. So, how was this formula? He said this formula sounded good and all that, but why didn't it work? And what he figured out, and Bill says this in this letter, that his basic flaw had been absolute dependence on people, places, and things. Dependence on his wife, dependence on, Lois was right by his side, forever. And if another person could sober up an alcoholic, Bill would have gotten sober years before he did, because Lois was there. She was there. She loved and adored him. She was with him on every episode. She helped him sober up. She loved him through it. And Lois, only time Lois really got really angry at him was after Bill sobered up. The story goes is that Lois thought they might have an evening at home, but Bill was going out to one of his AA meetings and told her, that he would see her later. And she took off her high heel shoe and threw it at him. And she said, damn you in your AA meetings. We had a life before AA. Now we don't have a life. You have a life with AA. And Bill realized then that Lois had gotten as sick, if not sicker, than she was. Bill is the one that actually started Al-Anon. He knew that, and if you ever go to New York and you see his original office, you can see where he helped Al-Anon's get started. He knew Lois needed some help, and he encouraged her. So that was the beginning of Al-Anon, because we do get sick. Family members can get as sick as the alcoholic or drug addict ever thought about being. So what Bill talked about was those underlying spiritual condition, that if that really is the answer, that's the answer for alcoholism, that's the answer to all of our problems, is spirituality. And so, in step 3, I like the way he broke step 3 down. What comes out of step 3 is what we work on in step 4. And how Bill broke it down was that, uh, any addict is eat up with resentment. And resentment, you look up what resentment means. SENT, sent, means it's a Greek word that means to feel. So the prefix RE means to repeat. So all resentment is to repeat the feeling. And so when we resent someone, have a resentment, we just get up in the morning and we start repeating the feeling of what somebody has done to us. That's not sobriety in anybody's book, and Bill knew that. And so resentment is talks about being the number one offender to any addict, because we dwell on what they have done to us. When you have a resentment, now we can have a resentment to ourselves, but a true resentment is where you perceive someone doing something to you and you replay it over. Maybe it happened 15 years ago, and you get up one morning in the morning and you get to thinking about what they did to you 15 years ago. Maybe you haven't seen them in 15 years, but you dwell on it and you think about it and you think about it. So a resentment is re-feeling and replaying, and that's not emotional sobriety. That is not. Emotional sobriety is calling, picking up the phone. This is the good news. There's a lot of good news about a 12-step program, but we can always call someone, pick up the phone, call someone in the program and talk about that resentment. Because what happens if we don't stop the resentment at the beginning of it, it grows, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So let's say someone does something to you and you resent them for it. And then you resent them so much that you go to them and tell them how angry you are at them. Maybe even blow up at them. That's not emotional sobriety, to have that rage come up. I've never worked with any form of an addict yet, whether it's food addiction, alcoholism, drug addiction, that there wasn't anger underneath everything. There's, it's layered in pain and anger and pain and anger, and that anger many times for folks, and it did for me, would turn into rage. So here you are, you got a resentment going, what they've done to you. And then, maybe it's somebody at work, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's somebody down the street, but whatever it is, they push your button and you got this resentment going already, and so you blow up at them. And I don't know if there's any ragers out there, but I am a recovering rager. And when I say recovering rager, I have not raged in, let's say, almost 21 years. No, 22 years. And how I measure that is my youngest daughter was pregnant with my grandson, and he's soon to be 22. And that was my last rage attack. And I'll tell you, it was not pretty. You can be clean and you cannot be using a substance and you can be going to meetings and all of that. But if you haven't dealt with those underlying causes and conditions on the inside, something can happen and it will tap into that massive amount of rage that hasn't been dealt with. And I had not dealt with my childhood. I would tell you I had, because I've done a lot of 4th and 5th steps. I've written about it, but I hadn't dealt really, worked to the depths. I had done a lot of work, but the rage was still there, nevertheless. And I want to tell you that little story, and I'm not proud of the story, but that is my emotional sobriety story. We all have a story, and this is my emotional sobriety story. I was doing a family week, working at my place of business, doing a family week, and we have glass windows out front where if you sat in the conference center where we do Family Week, you could look out and see all the activity pretty much in Buffalo Gap because this is a small town. Anyway, we had just completed that new building. It was brand new. It was the conference center, the dining area, kitchen, very nice, very brand new. I was doing a family week, had a house full of clients, and I went to work that morning, and back in the days when I wore high-heel shoes, I don't anymore, and there was rocks, a pile of big rocks out there that covered almost half of the street. Well, I was afraid a client or somebody coming along was going to trip over those rocks. So I went on in to the center and told our executive director at the time, his name was Bob, I said, Bob, will you get someone, or will you ask the yardman, someone to remove those rocks? I'm afraid somebody's going to fall out there. He said, sure, I'll take care of it. All right, at noon, they were still there. That was all right. I knew he didn't have time. Anyway, I'm not going to drag it all out, but day three, I went to work that morning. The rocks were still there. By then, was just about through with the family week, and I was training a therapist, and I saw her walking across there, and I said, Edwina, I want you to do this morning. And I love to hear her side of her tell this story because she tells it pretty accurate. But anyway, I said, would you go in and work with the clients and I'll be in after lunch? And she said, oh, and she was very capable. I knew she could do it. I went home and I put on my old garden shoes and my old garden clothes, old blue jeans, and I got me a pair of gloves on and a shovel and the wheelbarrow. And I went out there and I was shoveling those rocks. Well, here came Bob. Oh, Tenny, I am so sorry I didn't get them up. And I was so mad at him. And by the grace of God, I don't cuss like I used to. I guess I got it all out that day. But I called him everything I could think of and chased him back to the center with the shovel. And so there was a lot of rocks out there, and I just kept shoveling, And so one at a time, he'd send the therapist out there to talk to me, and I'd run them off, chase them off. And then our fire chief drove up. He's not anymore, but anyway, he was a dear friend, and he said, oh, okay, Teddy talks as a slow West Texas accent, and he said, what's going on? Bob had called him, my friend, the fire chief, to come calm me down. And, well, I chased him. I said, you get back in that fire truck. This is none of your business, blah, blah, and I cussed him out. I mean, nobody would want what I had that morning. I mean, I was not an attraction to want people to get clean and sober and live a sober, emotionally sober life. So I was just about through, but I just got madder and madder and madder and madder. And then my husband drove up. And when he got out of the car, he said, honey, what's going on? And I just broke down and started crying. And I looked around, and those family members were standing at that glass window, and they were looking out at the show. The staff was looking out the windows. Here I'm the owner of the friggin' treatment center, and I was throwing a hysterical fit. Now that is the example of emotional sobriety. I had none that morning. That was my last rage attack. Now, I guess I could get angry. I very seldom get angry anymore. And I lived in anger, and I lived in rage. And the staff was scared of me half of the time because they never knew who was going to walk in the front door. But I claimed to be in recovery. And I was much like, I'm not putting myself on Bill's level, but I was much like him. And, I had time in the program. I went to meetings. I had a sponsor. I worked the steps. But those underlining causes and that core anger and rage was still in there. So I'm telling you all of that to say I've been there. I'm not just telling you something I've read out of a book. And God did remove that rage from me, but He also gave me a frame of reference to go back to. And like I said, I very seldom get angry anymore. But when I do, I think about that rage in that day and the embarrassment, total embarrassment of it. And then I would think that night wasn't the only display that I'd ever made. You know, my father was a rager. I picked up his rage, and we will pick up our parents' unresolved feelings. And as children, we carry them into our adult life. My mother, was a drug addict, prescription drug addict, alcoholic, and my mom was a wonderful person and had so many good qualities. But she couldn't do anything with her life but drink and take pills and lay on the couch and be sick. And so my mother felt very sorry for herself. And she taught me to feel sorry for myself. So I got self-pity from my mother. Bless my heart, ain't it awful? Then I got rage from my dad. That's a deadly combination, because I would rage and then I'd make it your fault and I'd feel sorry for myself, and so that is staying in constant upset over something. And I got to, I went back. Of course, I called my sponsor and went back. She said, "Well, I'm glad you're ready to work on this." The rage. And so I went back and I did the steps one more time. The 12 steps, recovery is a living program. It's a way to live life. For me, I got very little parenting, and the 12 steps has been a parenting process for me. It has taught me how to grow myself up, and that that God is the teacher. So resentment is that refeeling. And then when we, blow up like I did, and what I had after that was that, self-resentment. Lord, I was so mad at myself. We get mad at someone else, and then we blow up, then we get mad at ourselves. That's self-resentment. Are y'all with me? And I felt so bad, I didn't even want to go back to work. I couldn't hardly face my employees or those family members. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I made a total ass out of myself in front of my business. And so I was eat up then with the self-resentment, so angry at myself. And this is the process that we go through with resentment. And then I moved from self-resentment till I got to thinking, well, it was Bob's fault. I mean, had he done what I asked him to do that first day, he would have got the rocks picked up. I wouldn't have gotten angry. I wouldn't have had to get mad. So then I went from resentment to self-resentment to self-pity. I started feeling sorry for myself. Well, bless my heart. I mean, no one pays any attention to me. They don't follow direction, blah, blah, blah. So I started feeling sorry for myself. That is the most dangerous feeling that an addict can have, is self-pity. When we hit that self-pity button, we're getting ready to use, because self-pity is, poor me. Look what they've done to me. Pour me another drink, or pour me another milkshake, or whatever it is to ease the pain. Self-pity. This is what the things that that we need to be emotionally sober around. And we've got a planned program of action to take. But self-pity, and self-pity, when we get there and we get into that feeling sorry for ourselves, that is the most dangerous place in the world. It's interesting that 16 years sober, Bill was, when he was at one of his lowest points ever. And I had a dear, dear, dear friend. I loved her dearly. She loved my family. She was the one there that really helped my husband get sober, even want sobriety. Uh, and, we were friends for over 50 years. She passed away last year. And the wind's blowing today. It's been blowing forever. I mean, here in West Texas, we've had wind for the last week. My dear friend, when the wind would blow, she'd always want to kill herself. She hated the wind. And so when the wind blows, I'm thinking, well, if she was here, she'd be wanting to kill herself. But she's a prime example of having sobriety and helping so many people. She helped many, many, many people, but she could not help herself out of that depths of depression. 16 years sober to almost to the date of Bill W's. She didn't want to drink, but she wanted to die. She wanted to kill herself. And we were just hearing about, I had just gotten back from treatment in LA for my eating disorder, and that's the first time I had heard the word codependency. And everyone out there was co-ing somebody, a co-alcoholic, a co-this, a co-that. And I really heard about codependency, but it was just beginning. And what I realized that's what we were dealing with this friend was the depths of codependency. She got her every good feeling about herself through working with others. Now that is great and good and all of that and honorable to work with others. But if you use working with others to fill up that hole in the soul, that's not going to work. God's the only one that can fill up that hole in the soul. So 16 years sober, we sent her up to a treatment center up in Wisconsin, one of the granddads of all treatment centers, and they were just beginning to talk about codependency. And what my friend later told us all, that she told the therapist there, she said, well, I just don't matter. I don't matter. I don't matter to anybody. And the therapist said, well, why don't you matter? Who says you don't matter? And she said, well, I say that I don't matter. And see, when we say we don't matter, it's not other people telling us we're bad, awful, and wrong. It's what we feel about ourselves on the inside. And that helped her, that 30 days up there and working on codependency. And what she realized is what Bill realized, and he wrote it right here in this letter. And I want you to read it. I want to read it to you. He said, certainly I realized the matter was my basic flaw had always been dependence, absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and romance. That he had always depended on other people to give him what he couldn't give himself. And, and I'm not telling secrets or stories or anything, but Bill had a woman problem. Bill had a sex problem. He was more than an alcoholic. In today's time, he would probably be one of the, in the front row of a sex addict meeting. Bill wrote the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and people always think that AA owns the big book. He didn't. AA did not own the big book. Bill W. owned the big book. He wrote it. He tried to sell it. It wouldn't sell. He held it in a warehouse forever and could hardly pay the rent on the warehouse. But nevertheless, when the movement started and it got into the Saturday Evening Post magazine about AA, then the book started selling. And the money went to Bill. Now, Bill, it wasn't a lot of money. I think a big book was maybe $2. But my point is 3% of every big book sold went into a trust fund for his mistress. Now, Lois knew that he had this woman on the side. And so, Bill was never really he lived in total sobriety from alcoholism. But I think one of the reasons that he was miserable is that he never got totally sober in all addictions. They didn't talk about it back then. They didn't talk about nicotine. He died, him and Bob both died of the results of nicotine addiction. We wasn't talking about all addictions back then. And we certainly wasn't talking about emotional sobriety. So I'm just kind of rambling, but the emotional sobriety is so important, because just to stop a substance, what that gives you is you have one nerve left and everybody's getting on it. My husband, bless his heart, he passed away almost 12 years. No, it's been 11 years ago this month. Anyway, he would always tell me, he said, you can share anything about my recovery story, just don't forget to sober me up. And so I'm going to tell a little thing about Ariel. My husband was a sweet man until he wasn't. We all have those two sides, but he was virtually a sweet man, and he got sweeter in sobriety. But I've been going to Al Anon for 14 years before my husband ever made his first AA meeting. I was already a therapist, I was working in the field, and I had given up trying to sober him up or my mother up. But we had a conference here every September over Labor Day. It was a big conference. People flocked in here from all over the United States and other places. It was a huge conference. And I went. It was like a social event for those of us in recovery. And, they'd have Al-Anon speakers and AA speakers. And I went. And so I would, if my mother was in town, and a lot of times I would bring her here just to take her to the conference. So we belonged to this supper club. It wasn't actually a country club, but it was kind of a sort of a country club, kind of a fancy supper club. So how I would get them to go to this conference with me on a Saturday night. Saturday night was the big deal. It was the main speaker would be there on Saturday night, and I just knew, although I had given up trying to get them sober, but probably in the back of my mind, I did keep thinking if I took them there that they might hear something. But nevertheless, what we would do is, and we did that for all those years, I'd take them to the supper club, and we'd have dinner, and they'd both have a couple of drinks. And then I'd put one on one arm, one on the other, and we'd go to the AA conference, And so we'd go to the AA conference, and they'd listen. I don't know if they heard anything or not, but his first year of sobriety. All right,
recording in progress.
My mother wasn't there, and but it was Ariel. By that time, my husband had this wonderful sponsor out of Norman, Oklahoma. He was here. He brought a big group with him. We had a big house. We were housing a bunch of young people at our house. It was going to be a weekend of celebration. Are y'all with me? A weekend of celebration. And they'd have a big dance after the meeting. So this was his first conference in sobriety after he sobered up. So after the meeting was over, I just felt so proud. I had a sober husband and blah, blah, blah. And we were going to dance and we were going to have fun. And then we were going to all go home, and I was going to have a big breakfast for the people that were staying with us. I had it all planned out. So as we started, and we were in separate vehicles, but as we started down the hall to where the big dance was going to be, there was an exit there, and my husband turned loose of my arm, and he exited out that door. He went out the door, and I went to the door and kind of hollered at him. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going home." And that's all he would say. "I'm going home." Oh my God, all of my plans just went to hell in a handbasket. I went on to the dance. I was sad. People kept asking me where Ariel had gone, and I went ahead and those young people came home to spend the night, and I was trying to act joyful. And I had a lot of Al-Anon behind me, but I was still sad that he walked out and went home. So I got home and he was in the bed. He was in the bed. Next morning, he got up in the best mood. He was in a good mood and all. And his sponsor had stayed at the hotel, but he came out and had to have breakfast with us. And they all sat around the table. And what his sponsor said was, well, Ariel, you're not drinking, but you don't have very much emotional sobriety, do you? And what had happened is he had never been to one of those conferences, let alone a dance, completely sober. I mean, it was a sober function, but he'd have a couple of drinks before he went. That was his very first one. And he broke down emotionally, and that really taught me a beginning lesson of what emotional sobriety is. We can be clean and sober, but we can act like horses' rear ends. Sobriety is about changing everything in our life, and I'm going to say emotionally and spiritually. Spirituality is what changes it. We can't change ourselves. Left to my own devices, I'm going to be the hatefulest thing. I have a hateful streak. I don't know if y'all have a hateful streak, but I have one. And when I get tired, it kind of comes out a little more, but not like it used to. It's not like it used to. And I don't have to rage at people. I do have emotional sobriety today. And, in the third step, it talks about what we have to inventory, and that is those resentments, self-resentment, self-pity. We have to inventory our fears, our fear, and we have to inventory humility, and we have to inventory our problems in the sex area. That is spoken in step 3. What we are short of. Those are all the things that we are short of, that we have got to inventory and see where that emotional sobriety. Otherwise, we'll never stay emotionally sober. And then we go over to the other side. That's what we call a personality chart. All of this comes out of step 3. It's a personality chart. And the only thing that will offset resentment and self-pity, resentment, self-pity, fear, pride, and fear of pride, I said humility, but fear, pride, and problems in the sex area, the only thing that will offset that is to live like God teaches us to live. Now, we're not going to do it perfect. We're not going to be gods, but we can be more God-like. And what is God-like is the only thing that will offset the resentment, self-pity is love, tolerance, and patience. It's the only thing that will offset. Love the thing that makes you angry. Love is the answer. Love, tolerance, tolerate. It's no chore to live, put up with people that you just love and adore, and if they have a bad day, that's not a chore to put up with them. The chore is to tolerate intolerable people you don't like, but you tolerate, you have some tolerance for them. Now that's God-given. So love, tolerance, and patience, and to have some patience with others. Go to the grocery store and there's a long line and you're up next, and here comes somebody with groceries, maybe 3 or 4 kids, and she's got one nerve left and all those kids are good. Patience is stepping out and letting her go ahead of you. It's about being kind to others. So love, tolerance, and patience. And then having the humility is the only thing that will offset pride. You know, it's good to have some healthy pride, to take pride in a job well done, take pride in the way maybe you dress or you look, or the way you keep your house. But false pride is that puffed up that we're better than everyone. The only thing that will offset pride is humility, having a little bit of humility. And humility, when you have it, you don't. When you think you have it, you don't. When you think you have humility, you don't, because it shows up with other people. It becomes an active part of your mind and body. Humility does. When you think you're the most humble person in the world, you need to work on that because you're not. Other people will see your humility. And then what do we have? What do we do with problems in the sex area? The big book says we all have problems with sex. What do we do with that? And what we do is we judge every sex situation by wisdom. We use wisdom to judge. And Bill was a perfect example of that. He failed the sex part of it. He did not use a lot of wisdom because he was a sex addict. We didn't know about sex addiction then, that it was an addiction, could be an addiction as well as drugs and alcohol. So if you want to know where all this comes from, it comes out of step 3. Out of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. You have to read it. And then those are the things in step 4 that we inventory. We inventory all of those things and see where we are, over in resentment, self-resentment, and self-pity, and overdeveloped fear, and overdeveloped pride, and those problems in the sex area. So I've said a lot. I don't know if you've heard a lot, but emotional sobriety is about taking those spot check inventory. I love step 10 out of the 12 and 12. If you've ever read the step 10, I'm sure you have, out of the 12 and 12, it talks about in step 10 taking, I always thought step 10 was that you wait till the end of the day and take an inventory, and if you've done harm to anyone, then make amends, immediately or whenever possible. And that is true about step 10. But another part of step 10 where you can make a spur of the moment spot check inventory. You can check yourself in the moment before you react to something, and you don't have as many amends to make. You do that spot check, and you learn to keep your mouth shut. Don't say something. Sometimes what is left unsaid is so much more important than what we do say. So taking that spot check inventory in step 10 keeps us in emotional check a lot of times. So that's what I have about emotional sobriety. And I think it's something that we're going to work on the rest of our life. And isn't that good? That's what a human being is. That's what human beings are. We strive to have love, tolerance, and patience, and have some humility. And like I said, when you don't even know you have it when you have it, because it is an inner feeling. And then that overdeveloped pride, we gain a little wisdom to know the difference. So, alrighty, I've got some long-term people here. Talk to us about emotional sobriety. What's emotional sobriety to you?